Hey, it's Verity here on my YouTube channel and blog Pretty Little Button. If you're new here, I make paper crafting tutorials for the everyday crafter. In today's video, we're going to be using a variety of WOW embossing powder products to create 3 cards with darker colour cardstock. Whether we heat emboss directly onto the card, use embossing paste, or add a heat emboss die cut. Heat embossing can really add pops of colour and texture with a whole host of darker colours. So let's get creative. So to start off, we're going to create a card panel using a stencil and lobster earth sparkles. Now I have a piece of blue denim Gina K cardstock and Juniper Mist Catherine Pooler ink. Using a blending tool, I'm adding ink in a circular motion onto the card. This is creating a darker colour around the edge, adding more depth to the plain cardstock. It's important not to add ink all the way into the middle of the card, as you want to leave an area to add like a spotlight effect. Now for a little more interest, I like to go in with a slightly more darker colour just on the edges to really emphasise that colour change. So here I'm going in with Blackjack Catherine Pooler ink. Again, I'm using that circular motion just to add the colour to the edges. Before we add the stencil design, I'm adding a little more interest to the background. Here I'm using Altenew pinstriped background stamp in my Misty, and I'm inking this up with Hickory Smoke Distress Oxide. What's great about using a Misty is if I haven't got a perfect stamp impression the first time round, I can easily ink it up and stamp back over in the same place as it won't have moved. The stencil I'm using for this card is the Altenew Flowing Heart stencil, and I'm using Heffy Doodle memo tape to secure the card panel down to my glass mat. Next, I'm placing the stencil over the panel, and I'm placing this off to one side for a bit more of a peeling card design, and I'm securing this with some low-tack tape. I'm then using a combination of memo tape and post-it notes to mask off the remainder of the card panel and stencil, just so I don't get embossing paste anywhere I don't want it to be. So here I'm using Altenew embossing paste and a spatula to add some of the paste to the top of the stencil, and then for a smooth application to a large stencil like this, I like to use my stencil pal from Thermoweb to drag the paste down over the stencil. I get a much more better application over the stencil this way, giving it a much more smoother look. Now as this paste is wet, we can apply earth sparkles over the top, as they will adhere to wet surfaces. So I've removed the stencil, but make sure that you've cleaned this straight away or leave it to soak in some water just to prevent the embossing paste from drying on your stencil. Next, I'm liberally sprinkling lobster earth sparkles over the paste. They used to be called Eco Sparkles, and I still have the old packaging, but you'll find this on the WOW shop under their new name of Earth Sparkles, and this range is biodegradable glitter. Now this needs to be left to dry completely before you can actually use the card panel. Okay, so for the second card, I'm starting off with a lighter colour cardstock for which I'm going to make darker. Again, I'm using a blending tool and adding something borrowed Catherine Pooler ink, starting at the bottom of the panel and moving upwards to about a third of the way from the top. Again, I'm using those circular motions with my blending tool. I keep adding the ink to get a smooth transition and blend on the panel, and then once I'm happy with that layer, I'm then switching to Suede shoes. This is a nice vibrant true blue, and this time I'm adding the ink to about halfway up the card. Lastly, I'm then going in with a darker blue, Juniper Mist, just at the bottom third of the card, just to add more depth to the panel. And if need be, I go back in with each blending sponge just to blend the colours and smooth the transition out. Now I'm using my stamps to determine the positioning for a little area I want to stamp at the bottom of the card to add more interest. And to do this, I'm using the pinstripe background to add a little flow table for the flower to sit on. So I've stamped this in Hickory Smoke Distress Oxide, and this is just tying the cards together. So it's important for the card panel to be completely dry before you heat emboss. So if you need to, just use your dual speed heat gun on setting 1 just to dry the panel. I'm using one of the vases from the Altenew Mod Vase stamp set, and I'm stamping this with my clear ultra slow drying embossing ink pad with my Misty. I'm using my Misty as I want to stamp and heat emboss this several times. One, because it's quite a large stamp, I want to make sure I get all the design stamped, and also I want to add layers to create more texture. So the embossing powder I'm using here is the Lava Burst embossing powder from Sarah Newman's Park Floral Trio set. As it melts, it has a lovely mixture of colours, and I'm repeating the process of stamping and embossing to add more dimension and texture to the card. Each time I add a layer of powder, I just loved how the texture made it look even more like a very realistic stone vase. Now to add the floral, I'm using a stamp from the Altenew Engraved Flower stamp set, and I'm using a few post-it notes. This is because I want to mask the leaves off because I don't want to emboss these. So wherever the leaves are laying over the card, I'm covering this with a post-it note. Once I'd stamped it in embossing ink, I covered it with opaque bright white embossing powder and then heat set this with my dual speed heat gun. Okay, so for the last card, we are going to add an embossed die cut onto the dark card panel. I'm using the Pink Fresh Studio Beautiful Blooms die, and I'm die cutting this out of white card. The easiest way to add the ink is to smoosh the ink pad down onto your die cut, and a glass mat is a great surface to do this on. Next, I'm covering this with embossing powder, and the one I'm using here is the Soft Mango embossing powder. Now this is a translucent powder, so if you were to heat emboss it directly onto the dark colour card, it wouldn't show up as this lovely coral colour. Rather, it would appear as a much more glossy, darker version of the actual card colour. You need to heat emboss it on a light colour to show its true nature, true colour. So here on the white die cut, you can see that the lovely colour coral just pops and you get that lovely shine from the embossing powder. I've repeated the process, adding 3 to 4 layers of the powder for a smooth and strong colour, and then I plan to place the die cut in one corner. I wanted to add more layers to the card panel before I did this. So for this, I am using an ink blending tool with Juniper Mist and Blackjack ink, keeping it more concentrated in the top left corner. I'm then going to add the pinstripe background again to this card as well, and I've just placed this stamp on my glass mat, but with the stamp impression facing upwards. I only wanted to add ink to a small area with the stamp because I didn't want the whole panel stamped up. So I'm just using my blending foam to add the ink, just so I didn't overload the stamp, but you can easily just use your ink pad directly to the stamp. Now I want to add the pinstripe to the same corner, so I'm flipping the card over and pressing down in just that top left hand corner of the panel, and this will add a little texture behind the die cut. I couldn't stop there though, I wanted to add more texture to the background, so I got my Altenew Pure White ink spray out and I'm using a paintbrush just to splatter the colour over the background. I'm using 2 sizes of round brushes. This is just so I get a variety of different sizes of ink splatters. This panel obviously needs to be left to dry before you actually can finish it off, and this ink spray doesn't take that long to dry at all. To finish all 3 cards off, I used the Altenew Hello and Hugs stamp set. The large Hugs and Hello was stamped in Hero Art's soft granite shadow ink and die cut out, and all the sentiments were heat embossed in opaque bright white embossing powder onto black cardstock. These were trimmed down into thin strips, and then I've foam mounted them all onto the card panels just to add a little bit more dimension. Lastly, each card was then finished off with Morning Dew Nouveau crystal drops, just to add a little bit more interest around the card to lead your eye around the card. I hope today's video has inspired you to get creative with dark cardstock and see how your heat embossing or sparkles can really pop. I think out of all 3 of the cards, the Lobster Earth Sparkles is my favourite card. But which one is your favourite out of the 3? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed today's video, please give it a thumbs up and why not subscribe to the channel. Don't forget you can hit the bell icon to be notified when the next video is up. If you'd like to check out my personal channel Pretty Little Button, I've also included a link here as well as down below. This was produced as part of my design teamwork for Wild Embossing Powder, and you'll find links listed below. You can also get 10% discount at the shop if you enter the code you can see on screen. Also, why not check out this other video for some more inspiration. Until next time, happy crafting!